If Canada stopped shipping one single mineral tomorrow, the price of bread in America would start climbing within a single growing season. That mineral is potash, and the United States imports more than 80% of what it uses every single year, most of it from one country. There's a second mineral tied to the exact same story, uranium, and together these two resources reveal a dependency most Americans have never even heard of. Both minerals share a strange common thread, both come out of Saskatchewan specifically, and both feed directly into sectors the US government has explicitly labeled strategic, agriculture on one side and nuclear power on the other. Two commodities, one neighboring country, and almost no realistic substitute for either one if that supply ever actually stopped moving south across the border. Canada is the world's largest producer of potash, and the Saskatchewan Basin alone accounts for the vast majority of everything the country digs up. Saskatchewan isn't just the biggest potash region in Canada, it functions as the biggest potash region on the entire planet, concentrated in a handful of mines around Saskatoon and Regina. Canada also holds the largest share of the entire planet's recoverable potash reserves, meaning this isn't a temporary advantage, it's a geological one that isn't going away decade after decade. Global production estimates commonly put Canada's share at 30% or more of the world's annual potash supply in a typical year. That single number understates just how concentrated the industry actually is, because Saskatchewan alone, one province inside one country, effectively sets the floor price for potash across the entire global fertilizer market. The other major producers are Russia, Belarus, China, and Germany, roughly in that order, with Russia and Belarus historically making up a large combined share on their own. China and Germany round out the top tier of producers, but neither one exports meaningful volume to North America, since China consumes most of its own output domestically and Germany's production is comparatively small on a global scale. Here's why that matters specifically for the United States. The two next biggest suppliers on Earth are both politically blocked from selling to America at any real scale. The United States sanctioned Belarusian potash producers in 2021 in direct response to the forced diversion of a Ryanair flight, and that sharply reduced Belarusian potash reaching global markets. Belarus alone typically accounts for something like 15 to 20% of global potash production in a normal year, so removing its access to Western markets wasn't a minor policy footnote, it was a meaningful chunk of the world's supply pulled off the table almost overnight. Russia's share sits in a similar 15 to 20% range in a typical year, which means the two sanctioned suppliers together represent close to a third of global production that American buyers can no longer access at scale. Sanctions on Russian-origin fertilizer exports after February 2022 did the same thing to Russian supply, cutting off the second-largest producer from many of its usual buyers. So the 80+% of potash America imports isn't spread evenly across the world, it's concentrated overwhelmingly in a single country, and that country is Canada. Estimates commonly cited by industry sources put Canada's share of U.S. potash imports somewhere between 80 and 85%, depending on the year and on Russian and Belarusian availability. That range has stayed remarkably consistent for years, which is unusual for any single country trade dependency this large. Most countries diversify their import sources over time specifically to avoid this kind of exposure. The fact that the US never meaningfully diversified away from Canadian potash tells you something important. There simply wasn't a comparable alternative source worth diversifying toward in the first place. Now here's the part that makes this dependency different from almost any other resource story. There is no substitute for potash at any meaningful scale. Potash is the industry name for potassium chloride and related potassium-bearing salts used as fertilizer, and intensive farming of corn, soy, and wheat draws potassium out of the soil constantly. That potassium has to be replaced to maintain yield, and no other element, not sodium, not anything else, can take its place in how plants actually absorb nutrients. This is a biological constraint, not an economic one, which is exactly why it's so different from most trade dependencies people talk about. You can't innovate around a plant's nutrient requirements. Without adequate potash, yields on staple crops drop directly, and there's no processing trick, no substitute fertilizer blend, and no technology currently available that changes that basic agronomic fact. The United States does produce some of its own potash, mostly in southeastern New Mexico, but that domestic supply covers well below 10% of national consumption. That's worth putting into a bigger frame. The US has spent decades building enormous domestic capacity and other agricultural inputs, but potash mining never scaled the same way, largely because the geology simply isn't as favorable inside American borders as it is across Saskatchewan. No amount of investment changes where the potassium-rich ancient seabeds happen to sit underground, and that basic geological accident is the real starting point for this entire dependency. The next tier alternative suppliers, countries like Jordan, Israel, Germany, and Chile, simply don't have the volume to replace what Canada and the sanctioned suppliers together represent. Even if every one of those 4 countries ramped production to its absolute maximum simultaneously, industry estimates suggest the combined increase still wouldn't come close to covering what a full Canadian supply interruption would take off the table. That's the mathematical reality behind the phrase, "no easy substitute." It isn't rhetorical, it's a straightforward supply and demand calculation that anyone can check against public geological survey numbers. This isn't a hypothetical risk either, because the world has already run this experiment once, in 2021 and 2022, and the results were visible in grocery store prices. Belarus sanctions in 2021, layered with global supply chain strain, and then Russian sanctions in 2022, pushed global fertilizer prices to multi-year highs through the rest of 2022. USDA publications and industry reporting both tracked the same story, potash prices spiking, and that spike moving directly into the cost of producing corn, wheat, and soy in the United States. That production cost increase didn't stay contained to farms either. It fed into elevated global food prices across the same period, connecting a mining basin in Saskatchewan to a grocery bill in another country entirely. It's worth sitting with that chain for a second. Sanctions on 2 Eastern European producers translated into higher fertilizer costs, which translated into higher planting costs, which translated into higher food prices worldwide. That entire chain took less than 2 years to play out, which tells you how tightly connected this specific supply chain actually is, even though most consumers never once heard the word potash during that entire period. That's potash. But the second half of this dependency runs through a completely different mineral with an entirely different set of stakes, uranium. Canada is one of the top uranium producers on the planet, and the Athabasca Basin in northern Saskatchewan holds the highest grade uranium ore found anywhere in the world. The 2 largest operating mines there, McArthur River and Cigar Lake, produce ore at grades of roughly 15 to 20% uranium oxide. Both mines require specialized freeze and remote mining techniques because the ore is so radioactive and the surrounding rock so unstable that conventional mining methods would put workers at serious risk, an engineering challenge almost unique to this particular basin. That technical complexity is itself part of why so few other countries can simply replicate Canada's position. It's not only about finding uranium, it's about being able to safely extract uranium this concentrated in the first place. Compare that to the global average ore grade, commonly cited around just 0.1%, and you're looking at ore that's roughly 2 to 3 orders of magnitude richer than the norm. That grade difference matters practically, not just statistically, because it means Athabasca ore can be economically mined and processed at volumes and costs that lower grade deposits elsewhere in the world simply can't match. It's part of why Canada punches so far above its physical size in the global uranium market. The ore itself is doing work that other countries' deposits can't replicate no matter how much they invest in extraction technology. In global rankings through the 2020s, Kazakhstan consistently sits in first place for uranium production, with Canada typically placing second or third alongside Namibia, Australia, and Uzbekistan. Kazakhstan's dominance comes from a completely different mining method, in situ leaching across vast lower-grade deposits, while Canada's advantage comes from the opposite approach, concentrated extraction from a small number of extraordinarily rich sites. Those are 2 fundamentally different production models, and it means Canada doesn't need Kazakhstan's scale of operations to remain one of the most important uranium suppliers on the planet. The ore grade alone does most of the work. The United States runs roughly 90 commercial nuclear reactors, and those reactors supply around 20% of all American electricity. That 20% figure has held remarkably steady for years, making nuclear the single largest source of carbon-free electricity in the country, well ahead of wind and solar combined in most annual accountings. Fuel for that fleet is a mix of domestic production, imported enriched uranium, and historically, blended down material from former Soviet warheads under a program called megatons to megawatts, which ran from 1993 to 2013. That program is genuinely remarkable when you sit with what it actually did. It took uranium originally enriched for nuclear warheads aimed at the United States and turned it into fuel that quietly powered American homes for 2 decades. Once that 20-year supply of blended-down Soviet material ran out in 2013, the United States lost a major fuel source almost overnight, and it never fully replaced it with an equivalent domestic pipeline. Since that program ended in 2013, the United States has leaned more heavily on imports for the front end of its nuclear fuel cycle, and Canada has been a central part of that supply chain. Domestic American uranium production has fallen sharply since its Cold War peak, and the mines still operating inside the U.S. have limited capacity to make up the difference. During the Cold War, the U.S. built out a substantial domestic mining industry specifically to supply weapons programs, and much of that capacity simply never had a reason to persist once the strategic priority shifted towards civilian power generation instead. What's left today is a fraction of that original footprint, which is exactly why American reactors lean so heavily on imports, Canadian or chief among them, to keep roughly 90 reactors fueled and running. There's been significant public discussion in the 2025 to 2026 window around U.S. executive branch actions affecting uranium and other Canadian resource flows, including tariff measures and funding tied to domestic enrichment capacity, figures worth checking against the latest government releases as they update. This isn't a settled situation, it's a live one, and anyone researching this dependency today should treat the specific tariff percentages and funding numbers as a moving target rather than a fixed data point. What has stayed constant through all of that political back and forth is the underlying physical fact. The U.S. fuel cycle and the U.S. fertilizer supply both still run disproportionately through Canadian mines, regardless of which administration is negotiating the terms. That's an important distinction to hold on to. Political relationships between Washington and Ottawa can shift year to year, but geology doesn't renegotiate itself. The Athabasca Basin and the Saskatchewan potash beds stay exactly where they are. So picture the actual scenario. Canadian potash or uranium supply gets interrupted, whether by a deliberate decision in Ottawa, by an infrastructure failure in rail or pipeline networks, or by tariff and political escalation. The next tier substitute for both minerals runs straight through Russia and Belarus, and for potash, that door is already politically blocked by existing U.S. sanctions policy. For uranium, Russian origin material faces similar restriction in many Western jurisdictions, and the global market for enrichment and conversion is concentrated in only a handful of facilities worldwide. Those facilities sit in Russia, the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, Germany, and the United States, meaning substitution is theoretically possible over time, but it does not exist at any real scale today. Building a brand new large-scale enrichment facility from scratch is a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar undertaking, which means even a country with plenty of raw uranium ore can't simply enrich its own way out of a supply disruption on short notice. That's the part of the uranium story that rarely makes it into casual conversation. The bottleneck isn't just digging the ore out of the ground. It's the small number of facilities on Earth capable of turning that ore into usable reactor fuel. Now here's the honest counter-argument, the one that actually explains why Canada has never simply used this as leverage against the United States. This is the part most resource dependency videos skip entirely, because a one-sided story of American vulnerability is a simpler narrative to tell, but it isn't the full picture, and leaving it out would make this video dishonest. First, the infrastructure runs one direction. The rail and pipeline networks that carry Saskatchewan potash south into the U.S. are economically essential to the Canadian producers using them. Those same producers have limited ability to redirect volume to tidewater ports for export elsewhere in any short-term scenario because the geography of the basin favors U.S.-bound shipment by default. Building new rail lines or expanding port capacity toward the Pacific or Atlantic coasts to bypass the American market entirely would take years and enormous capital, not something Canadian producers could pivot to quickly even if they wanted to. That's the physical reality sitting underneath every political headline about tariffs or export threats. The pipes and rail cars are already pointed south, and redirecting them isn't a policy decision, it's an infrastructure project. Second, the revenue relationship isn't one-sided either. The United States is the single largest end market for Canadian potash by volume, by a wide margin. If Ottawa restricted supply to make a political point, Canadian producers would lose their primary customer, and they have no way to divert equivalent volume to other markets quickly. That single fact flips the entire narrative around. Who actually holds the leverage here? On paper, the United States looks dependent, but in practice, Canada's own producers are just as exposed to losing their biggest buyer. It's a mutual hostage situation dressed up as a one-sided dependency, and that distinction rarely makes it into the political rhetoric on either side of the border. Third, the two countries' potash and uranium industries are deeply integrated as businesses, not just as trading partners across a border. Nutrien, a company domiciled in Canada, mines the Saskatchewan potash, while the Mosaic Company, domiciled in the United States, also operates directly inside Saskatchewan itself. That cross-border ownership structure means a chunk of the profit from Canadian potash mining flows straight into an American company's balance sheet, and a chunk of Canadian jobs depend on decisions made in a Florida-based head office. Untangling that kind of integration to punish the other country politically would end up punishing your own companies and your own workers just as directly, which is a cost few politicians on either side actually want to own. The political constituencies that benefit from continued exports to the U.S. are powerful in both Saskatchewan's provincial politics and in federal Canadian politics, giving both sides a reason to keep the arrangement stable. Saskatchewan's provincial government relies heavily on royalty revenue from potash and uranium extraction, which means any federal Canadian move to restrict exports would face direct political resistance from within Canada's own borders, not just pushback from Washington. That internal Canadian dynamic rarely gets mentioned in American coverage of this dependency, but it's arguably just as important as anything happening on the U.S. side of the negotiating table. Put all three of those facts together, and you get the real answer to the question this video opened with: why hasn't Canada ever pulled this lever? The dependency is completely real, the substitution pool is genuinely small, and the infrastructure plus business integration explain exactly why Ottawa has used restraint even while holding theoretical leverage the entire time. The recent political environment between the US and Canada across 2025 and early 2026 has put real strain on that historical restraint, more than at almost any point in recent memory. Tariff threats, resource nationalism, and renewed talk of energy independence on both sides of the border have all pushed this quiet, decades-old arrangement further into public view than it's ever really been before. Whether that pressure eventually forces either country to actually use the leverage it's held in reserve for so long is the open question hanging over both industries right now. If this video needs one sentence to sum up where things actually stand, it's this: the US has a real supply dependency it hasn't replaced, and Canada has a real short-term cost to using that dependency as a weapon. Neither side, historically, has wanted to be the one to pay that bill first, and the geology underneath both countries hasn't changed at all, no matter how the politics above it keep shifting. That last point is the one worth remembering long after this video ends. Borders and tariffs and administrations change constantly, but a mineral deposit that took millions of years to form doesn't move for anyone. The same basin that fed Saskatchewan's wheat fields for a century will still be sitting exactly where it is regardless of who's negotiating trade policy in Washington or Ottawa a decade from now. There's another resource dependency running in the opposite direction, one where the United States actually holds the leverage over a neighboring country instead of the other way around, and I cover exactly that in the video linked right here.